Story 1: The Mysterious Flyers.
What would you do if a routine delivery turned into a brush with something unexplainable? Imagine this: you're working a regular shift, dropping off flyers at houses like you've done hundreds of times before. Most of the stops are uneventful, ordinary houses with nothing remarkable about them. But then you reach a house that feels wrong. The windows are dark, the yard overgrown, and the air around it seems unnaturally still. As you approach the front door, you can't shake the feeling that someone, or something, is watching you. Just as you're about to leave, a woman calls out from an upstairs window, her voice strangely calm and inviting. But something about her doesn't sit right. When you look closer, you realize her shadow isn't behaving the way it should. And behind her, partially obscured by the curtain, is a figure you didn't notice before. Would you go inside? Would you trust your instincts and leave? This is the story of how a routine task led me to one of the most terrifying experiences of my life, a house that I still can't get out of my head. Years later.
It started as just another day on the job. I worked part-time as a delivery driver for a local print shop, and my assignments were usually boring but easy. Most of the time, it involved dropping off promotional materials like menus, coupons, or flyers to residential neighborhoods. That day, I had been assigned to deliver real estate flyers for an open house. The list of addresses was long, but the job was straightforward: walk up to each house, leave a flyer on the door, and move on.
The first half of my route was uneventful. I worked my way through neatly manicured suburbs, passing rows of identical houses with trimmed hedges and perfectly mowed lawns. Occasionally, a dog would bark or a homeowner would wave. But for the most part, I was left alone. By late afternoon, I reached the last neighborhood on my list. The vibe here was different. The houses were older, their paint peeling, and the yards overgrown with weeds. It was quieter. Too eerily so. The occasional car passed by, but there were no kids playing outside, no people tending their gardens. I flipped through the stack of flyers, checking the next address, 247 Oak Ridge Lane. I didn't think much of it at the time. It was just another house. One more stop before I could call it a day. As I turned onto Oak Ridge Lane, I immediately spotted the house. It stood at the very end of the cul-de-sac, partially hidden behind a cluster of gnarled oak trees. The driveway was cracked and uneven, and the yard was a tangle of weeds and overgrown shrubs. The house itself was 2 stories tall. Its once white paint faded to a dull gray. The windows were dark, the curtains drawn, and the mailbox hung crookedly on its post.
I parked my car at the curb and grabbed a flyer from the passenger seat. As I walked up the cracked pathway, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched.
The air around the house felt wrong. It was heavy and still, as if the usual sounds of the neighborhood, birds chirping, leaves rustling, had been muted. When I reached the porch, I hesitated. The front door was old and weathered, its paint peeling in long strips. The doorbell looked like it hadn't worked in years. So I leaned forward to wedge the flyer into the doorframe. That's when I heard it. "Wait. Don't go." The voice startled me, making me drop the flyer. It was a woman's voice, soft and calm but with an edge of urgency. I looked up and saw her leaning out of a second-story window. She was in her mid-30s, with long dark hair that framed her pale face. She was smiling, but something about her expression felt off, like it was too practiced, too controlled. "Are you leaving something for me?" she asked, tilting her head slightly.
Ah. Yeah. I said, bending down to pick up the flyer. Just a delivery.
Her smile widened. Why don't you bring it inside? It'll blow away if you leave it out there. I hesitated. My instinct screaming at me to decline. That's okay, I said quickly. I'll just leave it here on the porch. Her smile faltered for a moment. And then she leaned forward slightly. Are you sure? It's no trouble. Come on in. That's when I noticed it, the light from the room behind her spilling out into the evening. But her shadow wasn't there.
For a moment, I thought I was imagining things. The light from the room was bright, illuminating the walls and the furniture behind her. But where her shadow should have been, there was nothing, just an empty patch of wall. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. As I tried to process what I was seeing, I noticed something else. Behind her, partially hidden by the curtain, was the outline of another figure. It was a man, tall and broad-shouldered, standing perfectly still. He wasn't moving, but I could feel his eyes on me. The woman must have noticed my expression because her tone shifted. Is something wrong? She asked, her voice sharper now. No, I said quickly, stepping backward. I need to finish my route. I placed the flyer on the porch and turned to leave, my heart racing. Wait, she called again, her voice more urgent. Please, don't go. I didn't stop. As I walked back to my car, I could feel the weight of their eyes on me. I resisted the urge to look back, afraid of what I might see. When I reached my car, I fumbled with the keys, my hands trembling. I started the engine and pulled away from the curb, relief washing over me as the house disappeared from view. But as I drove down the quiet street, I glanced in the rearview mirror, and my stomach dropped. There, in the second-story window, was the man. He was standing in the exact same spot, staring directly at me. His face was pale, and his eyes were dark, unblinking. I couldn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the woman's too perfect smile, the shadowless light, and the man's face in the window. The next day, I told my boss about the incident. He listened patiently, then suggested I report it to the police. When I did, the officers were polite but skeptical. It's probably just a misunderstanding, one of them said. We'll check it out. But there's nothing illegal about a strange house. A week later, I got a call from one of the officers. We visited the house, he said. The occupants claimed they didn't speak to anyone that day. In fact, they said they've been out of town for weeks. My blood ran cold. To this day, I don't know what happened at 247 Oak Ridge Lane. Was it a prank? A coincidence? Or was it something far more sinister? The house still stands at the end of the cul-de-sac. Its windows dark and its yard overgrown. I've driven past it a few times since then, but I've never had the courage to stop. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd gone inside. Would I have made it out? Or would I have joined the shadows that didn't move? What would you have done in my place? Story 2, The Motel Room Intruder. Imagine this, you're trapped in a blizzard. Snow piling high around your car, and visibility reduced to nothing but a white haze. The highway is deserted, and the nearest gas station is miles behind you. Just when you think the storm will consume you, a flickering neon sign appears in the distance, a motel. Relieved, you pull into the lot and check into a room. It's nothing fancy, peeling wallpaper, a faint smell of mildew,
but it's warm. And it's safe. Or so you think. That night, the howling wind outside is replaced by another sound, a faint clicking noise. Like someone fiddling with your door. You freeze. Your breath caught in your throat. Looking through the peephole, you see a man standing outside. His face shadowed by the dim hallway light. He's trying to break in. This is the story of how an unexpected night in a secluded motel turned into a waking nightmare. A story that still makes my skin crawl every time I think about it. I hadn't planned on staying at a motel that night. The storm caught me off guard, rolling in faster than the weather reports had predicted. One moment, the road was clear. And the next, snow was coming down in thick, blinding sheets. I was driving through the outskirts of a rural area. The kind of place where the nearest town could be 20 miles away. The highway, which had been bustling with traffic earlier, was eerily empty now. The snow was relentless, covering the road in a thick layer of ice and slush. My windshield wipers struggled to keep up, and my tires slipped more than once. When I saw the neon sign for a Sunny Pines Motel flickering in the distance, I felt a wave of relief. It wasn't much, but it was better than freezing in my car overnight. I pulled into the parking lot, which was barely visible under the accumulating snow. The building itself was run down, with cracked windows and a faded sign hanging above the front office. But in that moment, I didn't care. The front office was as shabby as the exterior, dimly lit, with old furniture and a counter that looked like it hadn't been cleaned in years. Behind the counter was an older man with a grizzled beard, wearing a flannel shirt and an expression of mild disinterest. "Got a room?" I asked, my voice shaking from the cold. "Cash or card?" he replied, not looking up from the TV playing behind him. "Card," I said, pulling out my wallet. The man handed me a room key without much ceremony. "Room 12. Around the back." I thanked him and headed back into the storm. The snow was up to my ankles by the time I reached my car, and it took a few attempts to back it into the narrow spot near my room. Room 12 was on the far side of the motel, away from the main office. It looked like no one else was staying there. The other rooms were dark, their curtains drawn tightly shut. When I stepped into the room, it was exactly what I expected: old carpet, peeling wallpaper, and a heater that rattled when I turned it on. But it was warm, and it was dry. I spent the first hour trying to relax. I unpacked a few things, turned on the TV, and ate the last of the snacks I had brought with me. The storm outside showed no signs of letting up. The room was eerily quiet, save for the occasional groan of the heater and the faint hum of the wind outside. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The locks on the door seemed flimsy, a simple knob lock and a chain that looked like it could snap with enough force. I double-checked them anyway, telling myself I was just being paranoid. Eventually, exhaustion got the better of me, and I climbed into bed. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up.
At first, I wasn't sure what had woken me. The room was dark, illuminated only by the faint glow of the neon sign outside. The storm was still raging, the wind howling like a living thing.
Then I heard it, a faint clicking noise, like someone jiggling the doorknob. My heart began to race. I sat up in bed, straining to hear over the sound of the storm. There it was again. A deliberate, metallic sound, as if someone was trying to pick the lock. I slipped out of bed, moving as quietly as possible. My bare feet sank into the cold carpet as I crept toward the door. peering through the peephole. I saw him. A man was standing just outside my door. His figure partially obscured by the dim hallway light. He was wearing a dark jacket. And his head was tilted downward, as if concentrating on the lock. I couldn't see his face clearly. But there was something deliberate about the way he moved, like he had done this before. My mind raced. Who was he? What did he want? I backed away from the door, my breath coming in shallow gasps. My first instinct was to call the front desk. But when I reached for the phone, I found it wasn't working. The man tried the knob again. Harder this time. The chain rattled against the frame. And I could hear his breathing now, deep, steady, and unnervingly calm. I knew I had to do something. I couldn't just stand there and wait for him to get in. I grabbed the chair from the desk and wedged it under the doorknob, reinforcing the flimsy lock as best I could. The man must have heard me, because he paused. For a moment, there was complete silence, except for the sound of my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. Then, without warning, he slammed his body against the door. The impact was so forceful that the chain rattled loose, and the chair groaned under the pressure. I stumbled backward, my hands shaking as I tried to think of a plan. "Leave me alone," I shouted, my voice cracking. The man didn't respond. He slammed against the door again, harder this time. Just as I thought the door would give way, the sound of a car engine echoed through the parking lot. The man froze, his head turning toward the window. Then, without a word, he walked away. I waited several minutes before daring to move. When I finally peeked through the curtain, I saw nothing but snow and darkness. The man was gone. I grabbed my phone and called the police, explaining what had happened as clearly as I could. When the officers arrived, they searched the property but found no sign of the man. The motel staff claimed they hadn't seen or heard anything unusual. "It's probably just some drifter," one of the officers said, though his tone wasn't reassuring. "These places attract all kinds of people." I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. Every creak of the building, every gust of wind, set my nerves on edge. When morning came, I checked out as quickly as I could, grateful to leave the motel behind. But the memory of that night has stayed with me. I still wonder who the man was, what his intentions were, and why he chose my room. Would you have been able to sleep after something like that? Or would the fear follow you, just like it follows me? Story 3: The Creepy Gas Station Delivery. What would you do if a simple food delivery turned into a terrifying encounter with someone who seemed off? It started as a routine gig. The gas station was in the middle of nowhere. Just another stop in my night shift as a delivery driver. I didn't think twice when the order came in: a burger, fries, and a soda for someone named Jake. The directions were clear, the timing perfect. But when I arrived, something about the gas station felt wrong. The pumps were empty, the lot dimly lit by a flickering overhead light, and the small convenience store was closed for the night. Still, I waited in my car, scanning the lot for any sign of Jake. Minutes passed. That's when I saw it, a truck pulling into the lot, its headlights cutting through the darkness. The man behind the wheel didn't look like the kind of person who would order a burger and fries. His eyes met mine through the windshield, and a chill ran down my spine. It was in that moment I realized I might have made a mistake coming here. But by then, it was too late to leave unnoticed. As a delivery driver for a local food joint, I'd gotten used to late-night runs. They were usually uneventful, dropping off burgers, wings, or pizzas to night owls and overworked employees. But this delivery was different from the start. The order came in around 10:30 p.m. just as I was getting ready to finish my shift. It was a straightforward request: a burger, fries, and a soda, to be delivered to a gas station off Route 12. Route 12 wasn't a place I delivered to often. It was a stretch of road cutting through farmland and wooded areas, with little more than a few scattered houses and an old diner. The gas station itself was small and isolated, the kind of place you'd stop at only if you were desperate.
Still, it seemed simple enough. I grabbed the food, punched the address into my GPS and headed out.
The drive took me down winding roads, the darkness pressing in on all sides. The radio crackled with static, and I eventually turned it off, opting for the rhythmic hum of my tires on the pavement. When I finally pulled into the gas station, the unease hit me immediately. The gas station looked abandoned, though I knew it wasn't. One of the pumps had a dim light over it, flickering sporadically, and the convenience store was dark, its windows covered by metal shutters. A single soda machine stood near the entrance, its fluorescent light buzzing faintly. I parked near the pumps and sent a quick message through the delivery app: "Here with your order." No response. I waited, tapping my fingers on the steering wheel. The silence outside was oppressive, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. I checked my phone again. Still no reply. That's when I noticed the truck. The truck pulled into the lot slowly, its engine rumbling loudly in the quiet night. It was an older model, with a dented hood and a layer of grime that made its color hard to determine. The headlights illuminated the lot as it rolled to a stop about 20 feet from my car. The driver didn't get out right away. Instead, he sat there, his silhouette barely visible through the dirty windshield. I could feel his eyes on me, though I couldn't see his face. Finally, the door creaked open, and he stepped out. He was tall, with a wiry frame, and wore a heavy jacket despite the mild weather. His movements were slow and deliberate as he approached my car. "You got food for me?" he asked, his voice low and gravelly. Are you Jake?" I asked, holding up the bag. He stopped a few feet from my car, tilting his head slightly. "Yeah, that's me." But something about his tone didn't feel right. I handed him the bag through the window, keeping my engine running just in case. He took it but didn't walk away. Instead, he lingered, his eyes scanning my car. "You always deliver out here?" he asked, his voice casual but with an undertone I couldn't place. "Not often," I replied, keeping my tone light. "Just wherever the app sends me." He nodded slowly, then glanced at the soda sitting in my cup holder. "That mine?" "Oh, yeah," I said, reaching for it. As I handed it over, his hand brushed mine briefly. His skin was cold and rough, like he'd been working outside all day. "Thanks," he said. But he didn't move. He just stood there, staring at me. An uncomfortable silence stretched between us. "Well, have a good night," I said, trying to sound cheerful. Instead of responding, he smirked. "You too." Then he turned and walked back to his truck. But something about the way he moved made my stomach churn. I watched him climb into his truck and sit there for a moment, the engine idling. I didn't wait to find out what he was doing. shifting into reverse. I backed out of my spot and headed for the exit.
In my rearview mirror, I saw his truck pull out behind me.
At first, I thought it was a coincidence. Maybe he was heading home, taking the same route I was. But as I turned onto the highway, his headlights stayed close behind. Too close.
My heart began to race. I accelerated slightly, hoping he would pass. But he didn't. Instead, he stayed right on my bumper, his brights flashing intermittently. What the hell is this guy doing? I muttered, gripping the steering wheel tightly. As the road stretched on, the truck grew more aggressive. He swerved into the other lane briefly, as if trying to overtake me, but then fell back. The headlights illuminated my car's interior, casting harsh shadows that made everything feel more claustrophobic. I spotted a gas station up ahead and decided to pull in, hoping he would keep driving. But as I slowed down, so did he. Panic set in. I changed my mind at the last second, veering back onto the highway. The truck followed, its horn blaring angrily. By now, I was going well over the speed limit, my hands trembling as I tried to stay in control. The road ahead was dark and empty, offering no signs of help. Finally, I spotted a small diner with a brightly lit parking lot. I swerved into it, my tires screeching as I came to a stop near the entrance. The truck pulled in behind me, but then it stopped. For a moment, I thought he was going to get out. But instead, he just sat there, his headlights glaring into my rearview mirror. Then, without warning, he backed out of the lot and sped away, disappearing into the night. It took me several minutes to catch my breath. My hands were still shaking as I called the police, explaining what had happened. When the officer arrived, I described the truck and the man as best as I could. But there wasn't much they could do. Probably just some creep trying to scare you, the officer said. Let us know if you see him again. The encounter left me shaken. 4 weeks. I couldn't stop thinking about it. Who was he? Why did he follow me? What would have happened if I hadn't made it to the diner? I still deliver food occasionally, but I'm much more cautious now. Every time I pull into a dark lot or wait for a customer, I can't help but scan the area, half expecting to see that truck again. What would you have done in my place? Would you have stayed calm, or panic like I did? Some nights, when I'm driving down empty roads, I still feel the weight of unseen eyes watching me. As I sit here now, years later, I still find myself replaying that night over and over in my head. What if I had gone inside? What if I had ignored the warning signs and stepped through that door? Would I have ever walked back out? I never returned to 247 Oak Ridge Lane. I don't know who, or what, I encountered that day. But sometimes, when I pass by, I swear I still see that second-story window, and the pale figure standing behind the curtain, waiting. What would you have done in my place? Would you have trusted your instincts, or your curiosity? Let me know in the comments, I'd love to hear your thoughts. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Wolf Tells for more terrifying tales just like this one. Until next time, stay safe. And be careful where you deliver. You never know who, or what, might be waiting on the other side of the door.